You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your tough on crime host, Abraham.
And I'm going to be the, I guess, good cop to your bad cop host, Shane.
Nice. I probably stole yours, and I didn't even tell you I was going to do that. So
no, that's fine. That's what bad cops do.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about what humans do, what animals do, what things do, all the things, and kind of why we do them as much as we can. And there has been this thing going on in the world, I think, for a long time, and we'll talk about the history of this a little bit. We'll talk about what it is, of people and how they need to solve crimes and what the strategy is going to be for doing that. And so we thought it's time to take that on today.
Yeah, so we are going to talk about being tough on crime and what that means and just kind of how truly silly it is. We've got so much to talk about with it. I don't want to like spill the beans just yet, so.
Yeah. This episode comes out on May 31st. If you're joining us for the very first time, by the way, we like to acknowledge the holidays on which the publication of this episode correlates. And so we're going to rattle through those really quick. One is that it's Flip Flop Day, which I love. It's also Senior Health and Fitness Day, which is awesome. Mm-hmm. And it is National Save Your Hearing Day. So go, protect your hearing, wear flip-flops, and maybe go work out with some seniors.
Yeah, I like that. Especially Save Your Hearing Day as a musician who has lost much of his hearing.
Right, yes. It's the worst.
Big earplug day.
Absolutely.
It's also National Smile Day, which I love. Smile at people. Or don't. You don't have to, but smiles are nice.
Yeah.
It's Macaroon Day. I believe this is the coconut macaroon variety, not macarons, which are different, right?
Yeah, correct.
Yes, I just want to make sure that's clear because there's a whole debate about that. And it's also World No Tobacco Day, so in line with health and fitness, which I like.
And finally, it is Web Designer Day, and the coup de grace, the major amuse-bouche billboarded top holiday on the website we use to source this information is that it is Infidelity Hurts Awareness Day.
Oh,
in case you didn't know. Yeah, it's like so out of left field and sad. But
I feel like for folks that's happened to, that's the last thing they want. They're like, oh, I'm very well aware. I don't need a reminder.
Yeah, let's have a day to celebrate how much that sucked.
Right. And then like the people that I guess this would be aimed towards don't care.
Right. They're like, yeah, that's the thing that happened.
Yeah. It's like moving on. Interesting.
I'll let all of you know now, if you haven't already, you can help support this show by leaving us a rating and review, subscribing, telling a friend, joining us on Patreon. You could also write a law to actually decrease crime by addressing the systemic issues that cause crime and call it the Why We Do What We Do Act. And I'll talk about the other ways that you can support us at the end of this discussion today. But we should actually get into this today. Shane, what are we doing?
We are talking about tough on crime and what that means as a general rule. What we're finding is that a lot of people, politicians mostly, have kind of adopted this rhetoric about being tough on crime. And so we wanted to tackle that and define what that is. So tough on crime policies are actual criminal justice policies that primarily focus on exactly what it says in the title. Justice systems will be tougher on crimes that are committed. And obviously that leads to a subjective interpretation that we're going to kind of unpack. And so we should do that now. What does it mean to look at kind of what tough is and those different interpretations?
Exactly. It sounds fluffy. It sounds nice. It sounds like people hear it and they're like, yes, we need to be tough on crime. And politicians have been vowing to do this since at least the 1960s when they found out that their righteous vindictiveness could rally people behind them. And the viewpoint of tough on crime policies is that what that means when people say that usually implies harsher penalties, bigger fines, and preset sentences for crimes committed. Essentially, these were supposed to be universal policies for any crime. I mean, it's not unlike Hammurabi's code.
Yeah.
And we'll get into this, but it also has, it kind of ignores motive in there. So it's like if you were knocked unconscious and while driving and plowed into a store and hurt someone, that would be treated the same as if you were like, I'm going to go drive into that store because I want to hurt someone, and you deliberately made that choice. And they're like, doesn't matter, same thing. We're treating this with an even hand. You did a bad thing, so you shall be punished.
And I think that's an important piece here because, like, essentially what they're saying is a crime is a crime is a crime, regardless of motive, regardless of circumstance, regardless of history, right? And so, like, you have somebody who could have committed that same crime multiple times, or somebody who committed that crime the very first time, and they're going to receive the same sentence. And so it's kind of an unfair thing. And, you know, that's not to say that our current justice system is doing anybody favors by having a more subjective way to look at this, because you have judges and you have places that are going to kind of say, well, you know, because of the color of your skin, you're going to go away for 30 years for having a bag of pot on you versus, oh, you're white? Okay, well, community service. Like, we know those systemic things exist. We know racism is a very big problem, but it is one of those things where universal policies are a different kind of problem that will also just not work.
Or you sexually assaulted someone, but you're white, so we're going to elect you president.
Right. See? That's problems, right? Problems. Now, during the 1960s, more lenient sentencing policies were established in the U.S., which ultimately led to a decrease in incarcerated or imprisoned persons, which sounds like we don't want as many people in prison. That's probably a good thing, right?
I mean, I would think so.
Yeah, and there are people that disagree, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But in 1969, there were only 188,000 people in prisons across the U.S., with an overall decreasing trend through 1973. That statistic is going to be really important later, so remember this. In 1969, there were only 188,000 people in prison with a decreasing trend up through 1973.
Across the entire country.
The entire country.
Now, violent crime did begin to increase during the same time period, and I think a lot of people might point to that and say that's why. But it's important to know there is no specific causal relationship between less strict laws and crime increases, and we'll talk more about that as we get through the discussion, because there are some really important data that do show what the correlation is there. During the same time period, it is noted that there was a lot of unrest in the United States that more likely accounted for this increase in crime that had to do with things like civil rights, the Vietnam War. There was a lot of protesting going on. I think we're about at the point that we maybe got into, not quite the 70s, but more the 80s, getting to like satanic panic and the like reefer madness. That's what it is.
Okay. That sounds great.
Yeah.
That sounds like fun.
Which was a scare tactic depicting weed as being this drug that would cause you to like throw your hand in a blender and do like all kinds of crazy stuff that nobody's ever done when high.
Nobody's ever done that while on cannabis, right? So it's super interesting too, because I think another kind of contextual thing that's going on around this time is that you've got kind of 60s and 70s, you start seeing kind of the development of like new age movements. You see a lot of new religions popping up. You see a lot of kind of like the hippie stuff is starting to come up. And then going into the 70s, you start seeing people become very disenfranchised with it, because the idealistic kind of hopes and dreams they had as like hippie free love new societies were not working out. So like you have like this kind of like unrest that's part of like a theological unrest as well as like social unrest and all that too. There's a lot happening here. I was reading somewhere, apparently there were a lot of mail bombs happening during this time.
Oh no.
It was really, really wild. Yeah, there was a lot of stuff happening then.
And just to tie it back, for those of you who have been following us and listening for a while, just as a coincidence, this is also around the time that Scientology is really taking off and moving its activities into high gear. Not saying they're related, just pointing out the thing.
Just pointing that out. Also, you know, this is around the same time period that deinstitutionalization is happening. So, like, there's a lot of wild things. This is not too far off from lobotomies.
Oh, yeah.
They're even happening during this time. So it's a wild time for people.
That was like a reference to like 4 different episodes we've done too.
Yeah, there you go. So if you want to go listen to all that stuff, we have done all those topics. Now, policies began to develop related to victims' rights in relation to criminal justice at this time. So this shaping perspective, along with kind of ongoing debates about the use of the death penalty, essentially created a motivating context for the development of more strict crime control laws. And so all of these things together have kind of like created like, hey, we need to get this under control. It was at this time that there was a bit of a shift from like more rehabilitative systems to control systems. And so you're going to start seeing that like it went from like, hey, you're going to jail so you can learn a lesson and kind of come out better, to now, hey, you're going to get punished for this no matter what you did.
And the extent to which the prison system ever like in good faith actually plans to rehabilitate people, I think is questionable, but it definitely seemed like they kind of gave up the facade around this point. And they're like, no, we're about the pain. We bring the justice hammer down swiftly.
Yeah.
So this reform perspective started in the late 70s, early 80s with the goal in mind to help reduce crime across the U.S. Targets of this reform included people who were considered habitual offenders and people who committed violent crimes, high-profile drug traffickers, and crimes involving weapons of some sort.
Right. And so, just as an example of what this might look like, Florida had developed a 3 strikes policy regarding this kind of targeting anybody who was a habitual offender, specifically involving weapons. And so habitual just being like somebody who has committed multiple crimes, the same crime and stuff like that, just so we're clear. Like, we're not saying that they are offenders themselves, but they have engaged in this behavior multiple times.
Yeah.
Well, this 3 strikes policy was essentially this. If you engage in any crime involving a weapon, you got 10 years in prison flat, like baseline. If you did it again after you got out, it was 20 years. And then if you did it again after that, it was life in prison.
Yeah. So 3 strikes was obviously a reference to baseball, but the idea of like, and I guess we sort of alluded to this, but not really said it explicitly yet. I guess part of the idea probably behind the get tough on crime was that if there are harsher sentences in place, people will be less likely to engage in criminal activity because they'll be so afraid of the consequences for doing so, which implies essentially that people just want to commit crimes. The only thing that's holding them back is the punishment that is being handed down from the government. And that's the only motive for them to stay doing the right thing. And so the government then needs to have that level of control by having a sentencing policy. And then as you engage in criminal activity, the harsher you make the sentences, the less likely you'll be to want to repeat that activity because of the severity of the outcomes. So that again assumes that essentially the nature of this is just what can I get away with, and not that there's some other reason that you might be engaging in criminal activity, whatever that may be.
Right.
So just as a thing to keep in mind.
Yes, it is not a circumstantial view. Now, I remember in like the 90s when there were specific advertisements for this 3 strikes policy in Florida.
Wow.
Like, and it was like, when they would do it, they would put these commercials out and they're like, if you commit a crime with a weapon, and it was always some like gruff guy who was like, probably was just hired to do it, right? And he's going like, if you commit a crime with a weapon, it is 10, 20, life. Like, it had a slogan.
Wow.
Like, and there were billboards and stuff, and like, it was like 10-20-life-, and they were in like, like they made it scary. So it was like, a set of like prison bars, but in the background, and like from a graphic design standpoint, you've got like all the numbers were like steel plates with rivets in it. And you're like, okay, like that sounds scary. Like as a kid, we're like, oh, well, I definitely don't want to have a weapon. So I would like even throw away my sticks because I didn't want to be caught with a weapon.
And fun fact, there's no more crime in Florida.
Yeah, it's all gone. So it was truly effective. Florida is a very calm place.
That's right. It never makes the news.
Ever. Florida man who?
Exactly. This new reform focused highly on incarceration as a primary punishment for crime. Commit certain crimes, there is a mandatory prison sentence. It might be 10 to 20 days. It might be 10 to 20 years. Just depends on the crime. But again, you just have a mandatory minimum sentencing. And the idea again there was that it did not matter what the nature or the intention of the crime was. It was just do the crime, do the time. They'd probably say, thinking that was really clever because it rhymed.
They probably brought in some marketing genius to do that, which is bonkers to me. I could not imagine like the ethics that goes along with marketing, and then like knowing that that's your legacy. Like, oh, I came up with that slogan. It's great.
Yeah,
that's how I imagine how they sounded too. So, all right. So, according to a report in 1994, so we're still talking about these policies and stuff. Incarcerated persons increased from 329,000 people in 1980. Okay, so remember that other number before when we talked about what year was it?
1969.
So 1969 we had 188,000 people. 11 years later in 1980 we had 329,000 people, and then in 1994 there were 949,000 people incarcerated in the United States. So just as a kind of like just as a numbers game, putting all that together, there was a 504% increase since 1969.
Yeah. It basically doubled in 11 years from 1969 to 1980, and then just about tripled from 1980 to 1994.
Yeah.
And that is a huge amount.
Absolutely.
All right. We should probably talk about more people who are in prison, but first we're going to imprison you in an ad. We're back talking about all the people who are in prison that are going on during our tough on crime spree. And so as a couple of metrics for whether or not tough on crime is working, you could look at rates of crime. You could look at the number of imprisoned people. There's a lot of different things you could look at. You could look at the types of crimes that are out there. At the time of this recording, there are about 2 million people, up from that 949,000 number, in 1,566 state prisons, 98 federal prisons, 3,116 local jails, 1,323 juvenile correction facilities, and 181 immigration detention facilities, and 80 Native American country jails, including military prisons, civil commitment centers, state psychiatric hospitals, and prisons in U.S. territories. Whew.
That is a lot.
We got a lot of people locked up.
There's a lot of people locked up, and there's a lot of places to put them.
Yes, that is also true.
So we have 50 states. There are 1,566 state prisons. There's a county prison right down the road from where I live. It is a 10-minute drive from where I live. I have worked in that prison. So, like, just to kind of tell you a little bit about, like, how prevalent they are.
Well, yeah, what is the math? I need to do some sort of quick back-of-the-envelope calculations to figure out what is the math of the 1,566 distributed across 50 states.
That would be 31 prisons per state.
31 prisons per state. Wow.
That doesn't include the juvenile correction centers, which is about the same, right? So You're talking 1,323. There are almost as many juvenile correction centers as there are state prisons. And I've worked in some juvenile correction centers, and they are straight up prisons. They're prisons for kids.
No, they're hardcore. They are really hardcore.
So to go a little bit further, 24 states in the U.S. have the highest incarceration rates in the world.
The entire world.
In the entire world.
That's crazy.
Let me say that again. 24 U.S. states, separate states, hold the highest incarceration rates of all the world, of other countries.
Yeah, that's a lot. If you're keeping track from 1969, the 188,000 to the 2 million people currently, that is a 1,063% increase since 1969 in the number of incarcerated people in the United States.
It's too much.
It's a lot.
Is what I'll say.
So who are we putting in prison?
So there are a lot of people we're putting in prison. 49% of inmates are white, 35% are black, and 14% are Hispanic. Now, people ages 18 to 34 make up about 53% of the population, while 55 and older make up about 7%. And one of the more interesting ones I thought here was 66% of inmates have some type of disability, with 60% of them being men.
Wow. And that could be both physical and mental disabilities?
Yes, but there's a high rate of intellectual disabilities in prisons.
That is an astonishing number. I would not have expected that.
Uh-huh.
So if you look at that, although 49% of the inmates are white and 35% are black, you would have to then wonder, are 35% of the people in this country black then? So that, because that would represent equal distribution there? No. As a matter of fact, black residents are incarcerated at 3.5 times higher the rate that white residents are incarcerated, even for the same crimes.
Right. They're often given harsher penalties.
Right.
Like, not only they're more likely to go to jail, they're more likely to go to jail longer based on subjective criterion and stuff like that. So
yeah,
a truly systemic issue. We should probably at one time do like the school to prison pipeline and talk about that, because that is a huge thing that contributes to this.
Yeah.
Now, federal data show this: 93.1% of inmates are male, with 6.9% being female, and there's no reporting on gender nonconforming inmates. So, like, we pulled like a government website, and there was nothing on gender nonconforming inmates. So there's a lot of like really problematic policies around gender affirming care and stuff like that within prisons.
Nearly 60,000 minors, which is to say people who are under 18 years of age, are also incarcerated in the U.S. And if I remember correctly, that might also be more than the number of Scientologists in the world. That is.
Let's put that in perspective. There are more children in jail than Scientologists in the world.
Good job, United States.
Yeah, we're just like, number one. We're number one. We're number one. It's so frustrating. Oh my God, it's so frustrating.
It's easy to get lots of this mixed up because there are several interlocking systems here. We've obviously got local, county, state, federal, and hospital. And this episode is not necessarily about the prison system as in general, but it is pertinent to this discussion and why we needed to spend a little time on it before we get to talking more about those numbers and the effects that these policies have had. But yeah, we need to sort of start to paint a brief picture of the scope of incarceration to see how the tough on crime, what that means and how it's affected people.
We need to see kind of the impact on this to understand how wrong this was. And this is like the equivalent of looking at the war on drugs and how the war on drugs disproportionately targeted groups of people, specifically black residents in the United States, and how it became a significant problem. The war on drugs being a symptom of tough on crime, by the way.
Yes.
Like that was like kind of like couched in this. So this idea of tough on crime is doing more damage than good. And we'll see as we kind of go forward. The good news is, though, and all the doom and gloom that we just shared, there is some good news. Incarcerations have begun to decrease since about 2009. So we've been on a decreasing trend over the past several years, which is really, really nice. Like there is an overall decreasing trend compared to where we were, which means that 2009 was about where we peaked with how many people were in prison.
Yeah, that's fair. And that does make sense if you look at the numbers again. You had that nearly doubling in the 11 years from 69 to 80. You had a tripling almost from the 14 years from 80 to 1994. And since 1994, it's been almost 20 years. And the number just barely doubled in that amount of time,
right,
as opposed to tripling in the 14 years preceding it. So it did suggest a slowdown. And as you said, probably decrease since then, which I think ultimately is a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay. We've been talking about the prisons, the prison system, the people who are incarcerated. Let's actually dig in on these tough on crime policies and the active ingredients contained therein.
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, one of the staples of tough on crime policies is actually the standardization of sentencing for crimes with multipliers. So we talked about the 10-20 life thing, and that's a big part of this is no matter what your crime is, no matter what your circumstances are, if you commit a crime, you are going to prison or going to jail or going to wherever for X amount of time, and there's a formula for it instead of like looking at like individual cases.
Right, which means commit one crime, get one sentence, the same sentence no matter what, regardless of the demographic, regardless of the circumstance. Commit the same crime, now it's ×2 sentencing. And again, if you do it a third time, life, baby.
I think on the surface, that sounds like a nice idea. Like somebody might go, oh, well, it's equal. It makes sense no matter who you are. It's the same crime. Like, I think on the surface, without any sort of like actual thought, it sounds good. But when you start kind of getting into it, what we find is the overall rationale was not to focus on why someone might have committed the crime or what their circumstances were that led to the crime. This might all be aired out in the courtroom, and this might have been done during the trials where people have talked about that, but those pesky details weren't necessary when it came to sentencing. We didn't need to talk about it, right? It was just, you committed this crime, you're going to jail. Whether someone stole bread because they were starving to death or because they just liked stealing for fun, they were going away for the same amount of time. And now you can start seeing why this is, in general, can be a significant problem.
Understanding this, the shift in perspective went from rehabilitation to suppression. The active ingredient in tough on crime policies could be described as righteous retribution to punish the criminal behavior severely, regardless of the circumstance.
It essentially was just, it's coercion. It's coercion, it's fear-based, it's suppression tactics, and ultimately it's not fair. Like, it doesn't account for somebody's learning history, their disability, it doesn't account for any of those things. It is a blanket policy that does not account for the nuances that occur in people's lives. And I think that in itself is not helpful. It's not helpful for resolving the issues. It's not helpful for resolving that person's situation or their circumstances. And it puts people in a really bad spot.
But Shane, wait. Who cares if it's fair? Who cares if it's not addressing the circumstance? The point is that there is less crime on the streets because it's working, right?
That's a really great question. I'm going to think about that while we listen to these ads.
Okay, we made it. We're back somehow. I asked Shane the question, who cares about all the nuanced detail of whether or not it's appropriate to be incarcerating these people as long as it's working, it's having the effect that it needs to have in decreasing crime?
So the question of does it work? The short answer is no, it doesn't. It didn't work and it doesn't work. And we're going to unpack a few things about this. And the first part of this is that the original perspective about what was described as lenient sentences, kind of in the 60s and stuff, when they and going into the 70s before the tough on crime era came up, this idea of lenient sentences, it was widely a misconception by the public. What they found was with increasing crime rates, there's a motivation for something to be done. But these reforms that we talked about with this tough on crime stuff were the equivalent of putting a Band-Aid on a tumor without cutting the tumor out. Didn't address the core issue, the civil unrest among the U.S. population. All the things that were going on then, it was just kind of like, hey, you guys are having a bad time. Here's more bad times, is essentially what happened.
This misconception comes from a few places. One is confusion about the types of crime that were being committed, that is homicide, murder, robbery, and theft. And two, misunderstanding how sentencing procedures were being implemented.
Right. So to illustrate this, someone who may have committed a violent crime in 1979 prior to any reform may have still been in prison as late as 1996, depending on the crimes they committed. Sentencing for violent crimes was still quite harsh prior to any of these reforms. And so there was no leniency for these violent crimes that everybody was so worried about.
Second, these reforms began to categorize people as dangerous persons, and as a result, increased sentences based on these labels. But why is this a problem? If someone is labeled dangerous, they can never get better. But if they engage in dangerous behavior, that's something that can change, because we know that behavior can change.
Right. So earlier you heard us use the term habitual offender. Using the term habitual offender means that person can never get better because they have habitually offended, right? Like they will do it again no matter what. And so even that term is a real problem, but that's the term that's often used and to describe people who are kind of constantly in and out of the legal system.
It's treated as a character trait, as something fundamental to who they are, and actually is related to the fundamental attribution error, which I think we've already also done an episode on.
5 episodes we've referenced now.
Great, yeah. And that one, again, just is the tendency to associate someone else's behavior to who they are. When you capture a snapshot of their behavior in any given circumstance, you don't consider what that circumstance might be, but you always see sort of yourself, making decisions based on your situation and what that situation calls for. I mean, this is sort of a similar thing here. It's basically saying, like, if someone engages in crime, it's because they're a bad person who does criminal things and they can never change, and therefore we need to punish them as harshly as possible because that's just who they are.
Right. Now, to add to that, I think the label of dangerous persons means that they probably, and this is kind of around the time that criminal profiling starts coming up too. And so you have this issue of now somebody has a criminal profile for what a dangerous person is. So like somebody who is dealing drugs or a drug trafficker is considered a dangerous person, which means that automatically, whether they have committed this crime multiple times or it's the first time they've ever gotten caught, they're going to get a harsher penalty. So for example, as part of this new label of dangerous persons and for targeted criminals, it was found that high profile drug dealers were less likely to receive tough sentences at certain times, but any drug dealer would get sentenced for a drug-related crime. So what they found was like the high-profile people, the people at top weren't getting charged as much, but drug dealers, any drug dealer was deemed a dangerous person. And so any drug dealer was getting really harsh sentences. And so this is partially why we still have so many people in prison for like small amounts of cannabis possession. And one day we are going to dive into the failed attempt of the war on drugs and all that. We've already done DARE, so 6 episodes. But it is one of those things where that label was applied to people who are committing essentially petty crimes.
Right.
And they got harsh sentences for having just for possession.
Yeah, and just as you said, it made it so people who were engaged in much more serious crimes were not getting harsh sentencing, not equivalent to the level of the crime because it was like a first offense type of thing. And
Right.
people who were not engaging in very serious crimes were getting harsh sentencing, even though what they were doing was relatively mild and not hurting a lot of people. And of course, thinking about the likelihood that someone's going to reoffend, thinking about what was the motive for doing this thing in the first place, for those people for whom they've built their empire, for example, on violence and crime, it's, they're very likely to go back to that versus people who were just like, need to make a buck. I'll scrape together, whatever. I'm going to repackage these drugs and sell them or something like that just to get back on my feet. We're unlikely to continue to do that beyond having absolutely necessary needing to have to do it.
Absolutely.
But I kind of got us off track. We had a first, second, we're on our third point here. So the third misconception about this and why this doesn't work is that this is designed to be a deterrent for anyone committing a crime. As we stated earlier, that why do this? Because presumably tough on crime policies means people will not want to engage in crime. They would have engaged in crime, but you made these policies too intense, and now they're like, no, now I'm not going to do crime, is essentially what they believed those people's internal dialogue must be.
Right.
Essentially, the message being sent was that crime was governed and controlled by fear, the control of the government, those harsh sentencing, and just knowing that you could be sentenced to life in prison should be enough to prevent you from committing the crime. Because again, the only logical conclusion that you could possibly reach for what their rationale then is that people just want to crime all the time, and that the only way to get people under control is to instill the fear of consequences like punishment and severe punishment and what eventually and kind of does amount to torture and slave labor if you do that crime. And then you're like, oh, I guess I won't do this thing that I really want to do, because if I do, then I'll have to go, into prison for a long time. So I'll just stay the course, I guess. As sort of, again,
it's fine.
Yeah, that's the only, I feel like, way that you can logically explain that orientation to it.
Right. And so when you unpack that, we know fear doesn't teach what you do instead. So like this person who wants to commit a crime or is like predisposed or has a learning history related to whatever crime it is, like they're not learning what happens. Like what all it did was really teach somebody what to avoid. I'm going to avoid using a weapon when I go here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm still going to commit this crime, but I'm not going to use a weapon. As a matter of fact, I had a friend of mine who robbed a bank without a weapon. And they got a much less harsh sentence for robbing a bank.
Man.
Just to be clear about all that.
Wow.
But if they would have done it with a weapon, they would have gotten many, many, many more years. But because they didn't have a weapon, they spent a couple years in prison, but they robbed a bank. They robbed a bank.
And this is a friend?
This is a friend of mine. Yeah. So I know people is all I'm saying. So essentially what happens is somebody who commits a crime never learns an adaptive skill to survive in a social structure that's not supportive to their needs. So, and again, we talked about this, 66% of people are in prisons with some form of disability, many of them being intellectual delays. So somebody in prison may not have known any better, and they committed a crime because that's what worked for them, not because they wanted to be a criminal.
Then that's taking that circumstantial view and thinking about it, it's easier to commit a crime than it is to learn a new skill in a social hierarchy that includes as many barriers as you would find in the United States, because it's so difficult to climb out of your social economic hole or whatever place you find yourself. I think a lot of the system is designed to keep people where they're at. And we go where those rewards flow, as they say, even if the risk is great. If you're someone in these situations, you've got to imagine that like they're desperate. They don't know how to do anything else. They do know how to commit crimes, and they need to get access to something for whatever reason, be it money or safety or shelter or whatever. And they're like, look, I don't know how to get money or safety or shelter without, going these other routes. The only way I've ever done it is by stealing bicycles and cars and turning around and selling them and that sort of thing. And so like, I'm desperate again, don't know what else to do, got to do the thing I know how to do.
Dear listeners, I'm not speaking from experience. I'm speaking from what I may know about this lifestyle. But from what I understand and what I've heard, stealing is very easy.
I have also heard this.
I've heard this a lot from, mutual contacts is what I'll say. But the thing is, like it's very easy to I could walk into a store and grab something I want and walk out and probably not have too much of a problem. So I've done this very easy thing, and I have also saved money. So it makes sense that people would want to go certain routes for certain behaviors.
And I'd say even though I also sort of follow that rule to a fault of not stealing, I'm not if I find a $5 bill on the street, I don't then report it to the IRS as part of my taxes. But I think,
Ooh.
Even when I've seen people make mistakes when they're supposed to charge me for something and they didn't, rather than get away with it. And I'm like, ooh, I got this free. I'll go in and be like, I don't think you charged me enough money. And then, then they'll fix it. And that didn't help me at all. But I'm sort of, I feel like it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Another point on why this tough on crime policy or these policies didn't work, as this type of reform had led to a higher rate of incarceration. We saw that. But more importantly, a lot of it was unnecessary incarceration. Between absurdly harsh sentences and wrongful convictions, it is estimated that these policies have cost the U.S. and its communities around $182 billion per year.
Man.
So the cost of these policies, 2 million people in prisons, $182 billion per year. So just go ahead and let's look at this. If we were to assume that this were the cost for the 15 years this movement really took place, those really harsh policies from 1980 to 1994, okay, $182 billion. We are talking $2.73 trillion in the U.S. in 15 years.
It makes me think the next time the government's trying to work out the budget and they're people are disagreeing about it and they're like, well, what are we going to do about, all these expenses? Maybe go in a place like this and cut all the wasteful spending that is absolutely and completely unnecessary.
Yeah. Decriminalize cannabis. Get everybody who's sentenced to marijuana crimes out and cannabis crimes out of prison. And then that will cut your costs dramatically.
Yeah.
Billions of dollars.
Yeah, exactly.
God, it's so easy.
And it doesn't seem like it would actually result in an increase in crime, because the other thing about this is that it just didn't work. Just like DARE, it was a failed attempt to scare people straight, but that just is not how people work. And the time that these reforms started to take place, we saw a mass increase in incarceration from 1980 through 2009, almost 30 years of increases in reported and sentenced crimes. And it was quite clear that it didn't work just based on those publicly available data. There's something to acknowledge here, I think, a little bit, just in understanding that like crime has been decreasing for some time. It really largely started decreasing around the early 90s. And this was already, again, 3 decades after tough on crime policies went into place. So tough on crime has been a talking point since the 60s, and violent crime was on the rise for over 20 years after that started being a thing, and then finally started to decrease. And it's continued to decrease even after we saw decreases in the amount of people who were being convicted. So the data just do not show that tough on crime policies have had the effect of reducing the amount of crime that's going on in the United States. As a matter of fact, one of the things the United States is famous for, sadly, is our gun violence, among which I believe we're the highest rate country by like 3 times, like nobody.
Yeah, something really intense.
I think we actually, I'll have to double check this, but I remember last time I looked, it was something like more gun deaths here than every other country on earth put together or something like that. It is extraordinarily high in the United States. Maybe infamous is the better word for it.
Yeah.
But that's the thing that's been going on even with these tough on crime policies. Even with the highest incarceration rates in the world, we have the highest rates of gun violence of any country on earth.
Yeah. So just based on that fact alone, that should tell you that none of these policies work the way you think it does. Also, we need gun reform, but that's a whole different conversation.
I want to make sure I got my numbers right. So the U.S. does have the highest overall rate, but what it is it's 5 times that of the next highest country, which is France.
Wow. So while you take a moment to digest all of those numbers and all of those stats, and then also maybe, I don't know, write some letters to your representatives or like get into any sort of like prison reform, we're going to let you go ahead and set some goals. We're going to take some breaks for ads.
Okay, so I think we need to talk about what behavior science has to say about tough on crime policies and how that might work.
Yes, and also some solutions using behavioral science. And I think this is something that because again, we've kind of referenced the circumstantial view multiple times throughout this. And I do want to talk about some things that do exist in policy reform that do have to include that nuance and also behavioral policies. So with all this talk on moving toward reform and returning to tough on crime policies, we got to figure out what's next, because we can't let this tough on crime stuff keep happening. We're already seeing an overall decrease in violent crime through 2022, despite increases in mass shootings. That's another topic entirely. Okay, so for the most part, overall violent crime is decreasing. Mass shootings are increasing, different problems. But what are people considering as effective data-based practices going forward? And these are all different data-based interventions that are being used to impact the current systems and move away from these tough on crime policies. One of them is something called decarceration. So the goal of decarceration, and this specific value of decarceration, is to reduce the number of people that are imprisoned. It's nice and simple, right? So incarceration is putting people in, decarceration is taking people out. And this may actually be simpler than you might think. For example, when certain drugs are decriminalized, I mentioned it before, if you were to federally decriminalize cannabis, prior sentences can be revised to match current laws, removing incarcerated persons for outdated laws. There are people that are sentenced to crimes that are no longer relevant, especially in state prisons.
Yeah, and they're still in prison for them.
Right.
They have been getting moved out of the prison system. A lot of them have lingered there for a long time after the thing that they did was no longer considered a crime, which I feel like should automatically commute their sentence and doesn't.
Right. For example, if you have committed a crime related to cannabis in Colorado, there is no reason that you should be in a Colorado state prison at this point in time.
For a cannabis-related crime, yeah.
For cannabis, yeah. I'm not saying empty all the prisons, but what I'm saying is like there should not be a cannabis-related crime in a prison system in Colorado right now.
Yeah.
Same with Florida, same with California, same with Washington, anywhere where it's decriminalized. Oregon, everything's decriminalized right now.
Yeah, right? Another strategy here is challenging racial disparity in sentencing, which if BIPOC people are disproportionately impacted by sentencing laws, then reforming sentencing laws to include nuance and alternative sentences would be a good idea, trying to decrease bias that has led to the disproportionate imprisonment there. Things as simple as body cams can help hold those to power accountable for their actions toward marginalized groups and reduce unnecessary sentencing. And that'd actually be an interesting topic to dig in on, because that was part of the idea of body cams. And I think that has changed how people do their policing.
Yeah.
And sometimes in ways that are even problematic. But that'll be a conversation for another time.
Yeah. Another strategy that you can look at is drug policy reforms. So you could look at decriminalizing and legalizing certain drugs, and that can dramatically reduce crimes related to minor offenses. And the war on drugs, again, was bullshit, and it harmed millions and millions of people and entire groups of people. I strongly recommend, when it comes to drug policy reform, start with the book Drug Use for Grown-Ups by Dr. Carl Hart. It is an incredible look at how harmful the rhetoric around drug use has become and how that has directly impacted specific racist policies around a lot of different drugs.
Yeah. Another one here is limiting incarceration for probation and parole violations, which are very, very minor offenses most of the time, right?
Right.
Many incarcerated persons have ended up back in prison simply of these probation and parole violations. Sometimes they miss an appointment. Sometimes they they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, or for some reason they ended up somewhere they weren't supposed to be, those sorts of things, even when it wasn't that they were going out of their way to do anything wrong. By offering alternatives like education, extensions on probation and parole sentencing, etc., we can reduce the amount of people who unnecessarily return to prison. And again, there's always an opportunity here for increasing skill acquisition opportunities to help teach them something that they can do instead of whatever it is they were doing that was a criminal behavior as their primary strategy for getting what they needed.
That's a simple change, I think. Now, expanding voting privileges was another thing that was brought up in some of the resources. And specifically, they mentioned this. There are countless former criminals who have no voice in current voting systems. So by restoring voting privileges to people who have been directly impacted by these tough on crime policies, we can have a meaningful change from people who have experienced the system. Now, I think this is really important. A lot of times people that are making these policies are people who are, let's face it, if you have somebody who is cracking down on something, they are probably somebody who is actively committing a crime. We've seen that plenty of times, right? Where it's somebody's oh, we don't like this. It's but you're doing that thing. So I think by expanding voting privileges to people who are felons or committed felons or anything like that, you're giving people who have directly experienced these types of policies firsthand, who have impacted their lives, you're giving them an opportunity to have a voice in changing and reforming and refining these things so they don't have the same adverse effects on other people.
Yeah. Another one is improving youth justice initiatives. As we mentioned before, with the 60,000 plus minors who are currently incarcerated in the United States, by spending more money on social programs and youth initiatives, improving access to resources, for example, social help, mental health resources, education resources, we can teach those skills earlier as a preventative measure to reduce the likelihood that they'll ever do anything criminal and then end up in the system where it's often very difficult to get out of that system.
We should probably do an episode one day on things like the Boys and Girls Club and different youth initiatives like that, which are like local community services and in low socioeconomic areas, and how they influence and impact those places. Because those, you hear stories all the time about how impactful those programs are.
For sure, yeah.
All right. And then the last thing that I think is something that's totally doable is a reform extreme sentencing statutes. So the current statutes haven't been helpful to the tune of over $2 trillion at least. At least. So what we're finding is these policies and these statutes are not working the way that they intended, and it's actually costing us a lot more money in the United States. By reforming statutes, reforming laws, reforming processes, we can actually begin to implement alternative options, alternative sentencing, education, stuff like that, for sentencing that can focus on rehabilitation. And ultimately, that's what we should be looking at. If somebody is committing a crime, then we need to look at some rehabilitative, some acquisition level intervention that's going to be far more effective.
Exactly. And that does speak to considering why people are doing these criminal things to begin with. At the time of this episode, there are 411 private prisons, meaning these are prisons that are monitored by the Department of Justice, but operated by a private company and as a private company. But we got to think about this for a second. This is capitalism in incarceration. And while many people might see that ultimately as a good thing, as it relieves the burden on the state, there's a couple important considerations. One, the state does still have to fund a lot of these in many ways, almost entirely sometimes.
Yes.
That is the way that it is funded. And what that often means is thinking about, two, the priorities of the prison. When you're a private entity, your priorities are your bottom line, how much money you can make, which means that, three, they're going to pack that place as tightly as they possibly can and reduce their overhead as much as they possibly can. So you end up with these disease-ridden, filthy, violent, terrifying places that people routinely die in because they basically get paid per head and various compensations for how to, essentially just keep the doors open and the lights on. And they are not incentivized at all to take care of those people. They're incentivized to basically keep them in there, and that's it. Keeping them alive is kind of secondary priority, although they do get more money for that. Huh? And so it's really not designed to be a place that is suitable for humans to survive long term. And they can just be really horrible places.
Just from firsthand experience, I had a family member who passed away as a result of poor care in a private prison system.
Wow.
And that is not an exaggeration. And so when we talk about this, like, it is, the incentives are low, the training program. I mean, most of what the private prison systems are is like the correctional officers and all the folks that are working there, the personnel are usually on a private payroll. It's a company that gets a government fund and they are on a private payroll. So they're not state or government employees. And that's usually where all the funding goes. Is like, okay, we can train people, we can do all this, we can bring in correctional officers, but they are usually private employees.
And that was important to mention too, because that goes to the rehabilitative part of this and thinking about why people do criminal things in the first place is when they end up in these any prison really that doesn't have rehabilitation as a focus. But in private prisons, for example, they really have no incentive to try and help people get out and get back on their feet.
Right.
It's really to keep them in and just don't let them escape and try not to let them die.
Right, exactly. Now, a couple other things, too, that I think is worth mentioning. Only about 23% of people who have been in prison stay out of prison.
Yeah.
So 23% of people who go into prison stay out. There's a very high recidivism rate for folks that come out of prison. And again, that goes back to alternative sentencing that could be a solution. That goes back to teaching and education, all of those things that we talk about. And then the last little bit is that drug possession is actually sentenced at a higher rate than drug sale. So remember earlier when we talked about how they were trying to target these high-profile drug traffickers? What we're finding is possession is getting sentenced at a higher rate more often, and more people are going to prison for possession over sale.
Yes. I'm going to throw in just my own, I guess it's sort of a take home, but also my own opinion about this, because I think someone might hear this and think like, well, hold on. If we're seeing a decrease in crime that's happening overall, and there's like these tough on crime policies, then maybe those tough on crime policies are working. And the other thing you might be thinking is, so what if a lot of people end up in prison? Like, the fact that we're decreasing the amount of people just means we're putting more criminals on the street. Like, I could hear someone having that argument toward this, but I think there's a couple of things to consider in that. With respect to the first part, the path of correlations don't line up very well. Like, we've actually had a decrease in crime long after people were trying to put in the tough on crime policies, after which there was actually a huge increase in crime. And it does seem like those data just don't map onto each other. It really does not seem to suggest that tough on crime has had the beneficial impact. It seems like the circumstances under which crime was taking place were being addressed in such a way that crime was on the decrease overall anyway, at least in some amount, because it's getting to the point where it's at some of the lowest rates it's been in decades, barring some things that happened in the last 6 or 7 years that are worth talking about in some capacity. But anyway, that's the thing to consider. So the second part here is thinking about what prison is intended to do and why people end up there in the first place. And one of them is that people see prison as a few things. It can be just punishment. We're mad at you. We want you to suffer for the thing that you've done. Right. Another thing that prison can serve as, you are dangerous. We need to keep you and prevent you from doing this dangerous thing again. And those are kind of the two ways that people orient to it. And people might also think about prison as like, this is a place where you can learn to get better. And then when you come out, then you'll be in a position to better serve society. The last one, I think, is a pipe dream. I think it's almost never been realized. And I don't think most people who are involved in the policymaking around this actually care whether that's the outcome. And so instead, I think you kind of have the other two, which is, we're mad at you and we want you to suffer. or we're dangerous and we want to keep you away from other one. And my opinion on this has been for a while now, I feel like the most efficient way for us to use our space and our money that we're spending on the system is that the people who are dangerous, like they have motive, they have means, they have a network, they have demonstrated time and time again that they have done violent, harmful crimes, or they have harmed people. Those are the people that I think are the most needing to be kept away from the general public, because we've already seen that when they're out, they are going to harm people. That's the thing, that like that pattern is well established.
Yeah.
We should still try and rehabilitate them. Absolutely, we should.
Yeah.
But those are the people that I think they need to be kept away from other people. Most people are going to prison for things that are not violent crimes. And for those people, I think, first of all, a lot of time they're unlikely to reoffend anyway, because the circumstances in which they did that were a one-time thing that just happened to come up for them. But second of all, even if they that was a thing they did a lot and that was a skill set they developed and they just eventually got caught for it, putting them away, it doesn't do anything really. Like if they were just out doing things where they weren't actually harming someone. And I think the drugs is a really good example of people who just took drugs, for example.
Right.
Or like if they just took someone's money, like, yes, that's a problem. And that can be really harmful that can be really impactful for a lot of people. But like things that are just like petty theft or other crimes of that nature that are just stealing, just property related, that sort of thing. That to me is like, it makes sense for you to lose privileges and rights for doing that, but being locked in a cage in like a place that like really does not care about you,
right,
and like having all of your freedoms taken away does not seem like it's calibrated for the level of that crime and the likelihood of it occurring again. So that's sort of been my thought about it, is like, let's think about this practically. What are we trying to get here? What are we trying to do? And to me, it seems like violent crime is the one that needs to be kept away from people, and other crime, like, sure, lose rights and privileges, but I don't think it does anything to like take away people's freedoms that dramatically, and it is extremely expensive.
Right. And in that money that's being used, that's making these programs as costly as they are, this is probably a take-home point for me. The money that's being used at the end of all this, right? Like when you think about it and how much money and time is spent incarcerating people, could be used for prevention programs and social programs that would easily prevent this at a discount.
Oh, yeah. A huge discount.
Huge discount. I mean, for examples of this, I recommend everybody go read The Nurture Effect by Anthony Biglan, because that is a perfect example of multiple examples of programs that are designed to be preventative in nature, that prevent things that are significant strains on social resources. He shows it time and time again. Oh, you want to end teen smoking? Here's how you do this. Oh, you worried about teen pregnancy? Here's how you do this. And boom, boom, boom. It is all these things. And why that's not applied here is astounding to me, and why nobody thinks for a second that a crime is essentially some level of skill deficit on some way. And the fact that none of our programs are teaching skill acquisition to keep people out, or at least the majority of them are not. I mean, just you see that by the 23% people staying out, right?
Right.
And so I think a lot of work could be done to reallocate those funds. We're already doing the work. We're already doing the effort. We're already putting it out there. We're already spending the money. So why not reallocate it to the front end and save billions or trillions of dollars on this?
Yeah, so I think my final take home just is that this whole idea of tough on crime, it doesn't mean anything. Like once you really start to think about it, it is at best problematic, like,
right,
and at worst could be extremely harmful and counterproductive. I think we look at countries that do not have as severe penalties, that do not have as severe and as many widespread laws as the United States does, and they also do not have high crime rates.
Right.
It's not because everything's legal, and it's not because everyone's getting away with crime. It is because people don't need to get away with crime, because a lot of times those countries have invested in systems to address the kinds of variables that tend to result in people engaging in criminal behavior.
Right.
So like, the United States spends a ton of money incarcerating people and has a crime problem. Other countries do not spend a ton of money and do not incarcerate a lot of people and do not have crime problems. That alone should tell you that the system is not working.
Yeah, that should be enough. That should be enough. But it is not, apparently. So,
all right. You have any other take-home points before we wrap this up?
Go check out thesentencingproject.com. As a general recommendation. It's a really good organization that does some really cool work around prison reform and sentencing reform.
Nice to know. All right, I'll put that link in here so that people, when you go to this, you can find thesentencingproject.com. All right, perfect. Well, I know that you love to listen to recommendations, so before we get to recommendations, we're going to get to some ads. right, welcome back. We're going to talk about recommendations, but first, I'm going to say my thank yous. I'm going to get them out of the way now. I would like to thank all of our people on Patreon who have helped support us over the years and continue to do so. You are amazing. Thank you to Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Josh, the Daily BA, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, and Brian. Thank you to my team, of course, editing and production by Justin Greenhouse, writing and fact-checking by Shane, Jess, and myself. And then, of course, thank you to everybody who is listening to us right now. Now, let us go ahead and get to our recommendations.
Recommendations.
So I recently sat and watched a movie that I'd been wanting to see because I liked the director and I heard it was really good. And I watched Elvis by Baz Luhrmann.
Nice.
Have you seen that yet?
I have not seen it yet.
It's long. It's a long movie.
Good to know.
I will say this, though. I never had a particular interest about Elvis, just knowing that he's like generally kind of like a problematic figure for multiple reasons. But I think that this movie was done pretty tastefully and did show a little bit about how he was kind of a victim of certain circumstances, like kind of being like young and bright-eyed and being taken advantage of people in the industry. Like, there's a whole lot to unpack within that. Like, was Elvis a great person? He had some problems, and we'll kind of leave it at that. But Austin Butler does an incredible job in this. Every actor in it does really, really great. Even Tom Hanks, he has a weird accent in it. Apparently, the person he plays was Dutch and had like kind of like a stilted accent. Mm-hmm. So at first, it's kind of jarring when you don't know that. But once you do know that about the person that he's playing, you realize like, oh, this is what's going on. But if you're not familiar with Baz Luhrmann's work, he did The Great Gatsby. He did Moulin Rouge. He has like a very stylized look about the way he directs. And he applies that here. So it's like almost like the story of Elvis as a fever dream. And it's pretty great. Like, it's a pretty incredible thing. And Austin, like I said, Austin Butler, it's worth it just for watching Austin Butler's performance alone.
Fun. All right, cool. Well,
yeah,
on the list.
I love it.
Okay, I have a recommendation and kind of a bonus recommendation. My actual recommendation is the TV show Penn and Teller Fool Us. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Penn and Teller are Las Vegas magicians, not musicians. Well, Penn plays stand-up bass, but
yeah,
they're magicians. They're the longest running headlining act in all of Las Vegas history. They are very famous for a lot of revealing how magic tricks are done, but also just like they've been doing a lot of stuff for a long time.
Yeah.
Anyway, this TV show, like, I'm not a huge fan of reality, but reality TV shows and reality in general, I guess. But reality TV shows. But this one, what happens is other magicians come on, they perform a trick, and Penn and Teller basically they try and guess how the trick was done. They basically talk in kind of code to the magician to let them know like things about the trick, how it might be done. And as the audience member, you don't really know what that is, but you kind of get a sense of what. Anyway, it's just really fun to watch as them sort of breaking down how the trick is done. So they don't really spoil most of the tricks. What's always fun is how often like somebody does fool Penn and Teller. Basically mean that Penn and Teller don't know how the trick is done.
Yeah.
And then those people they call foolers then get to end up doing a show with Penn and Teller at their theater, which is really cool.
That is really cool.
It's such a fun show. I love watching it. You get a huge, cool demographic of different people around the world, different genders and races and backgrounds and ethnicities and histories and languages. Some of them even have like translators up there to help with the show, which is kind of fun. So it's really cool. There's like 9 seasons and I'm actually on season 5 right now, so I'm a little behind, but I've really been enjoying it.
What does it stream on?
CW.
Okay, yeah. It is a cool show. I've seen a couple episodes of it, and it's like it is really, really cool. It's really interesting watching them interact and like how they explain how the trick is done without spoiling the trick, because that's like the magician's bread and butter, right? Like if you spoil my trick, then I can't do it anywhere. But it's cool how they protect the industry secrets around that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, really fun show. My sort of bonus recommend is I've been having this thought, and just because we're talking about sort of violence and crime on this, I've been having this thought that I would like to propose that the entire world from here on out, if ever any country is going to engage in war, they do it as a paintball gun war instead. And we just all agree that the rule is if you get hit in a critical spot with a paintball, you're out and you have to sit on sidelines. And then eventually the last person standing or whoever has the largest group after a certain amount of time or whatever are the winners of that war. And that's just how we'll resolve conflicts from now on, is with paintball. I think we should give it a try. I think if everyone, like, I'm just going to put that idea out there. All you world leaders who are definitely listening to our podcast, just consider from now on, we'll all just do paintball battles instead. And we'll just get rid of guns and instead paintball will be how we resolve world conflicts. That's my proposal. I'd just like to put that out there.
I like that. I actually like that, and I like the idea of just like healthy sports competition.
Yeah.
In general, or like just something like that. It's like, oh, like, okay, so like, we'll say, maybe like France and England get into some conflict about something and they have to duke it out with skee ball.
Exactly. I think it's
kind of
really,
love that.
I think it's the best way to go, is just some sort of sport event. In the paintball, you still get to shoot at each other, and we just agree to the rules that you're just out.
Yeah, I like it. I like that. Main rule: no frozen paintballs. That's not nice.
That's true. You have to no frozen paintballs. Come on, we got to be civil.
Yeah. I like it.
All right. Please consider supporting our show. You can pick up merch at our web store. We've got mugs and sweaters and hats and all kinds of stuff that you can get over there. You can join us on Patreon. If we get up to 15 patrons, then we are going to do a live hangout event where we'll talk and chat and do kind of fun stuff. And we'll set up some more activities like that as we set more patron goals. So come over and join us so that we can reach that goal. Otherwise, if you'd like to tell us about your thoughts on Tough on Crime, you'd like to agree with us, send us some awesome compliments and just tell us generally how great of a job we did, you can email us directly, info@www.podcast.com, or reach out to us on social media. Of course, we're happy to accept constructive criticism, so feel free to send that that way. But all of you haters who have nothing useful to say, you can keep your opinions to yourselves and go away.
Yep.
But I think that's all that I have about this. Anything that I forgot or anything that you would like to add, Shane?
Nothing on my end. I think that covers it.
Cool. Have an unincarcerated happy day. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.